The return to the Philippines, one of the most significant and pivotal operations of the Pacific War, marked the beginning of the final Allied push toward Japan. The operation, officially known as Operation Kingfisher, the liberation of the Philippines, was a key turning point in the war, as the Allied forces sought to reclaim the Philippines from Japanese occupation and re-establish control over vital strategic islands in the Pacific. This campaign was crucial not only for its military importance but also for its symbolic significance, marking the return of General Douglas MacArthur to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise made in 1942, "I shall return." The liberation of the Philippines had lasting effects on the course of the war, inflicting significant losses on the Japanese Empire and contributing to the eventual downfall of Japan in 1945. The Philippines under Japanese occupation. The Japanese had occupied the Philippines in 1942, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rapid expansion of Japan's empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. General MacArthur, who was the commanding officer of U.S. Army forces in the Far East, was forced to retreat from the Philippines in the face of overwhelming Japanese forces, leaving behind a small resistance movement. The Japanese forces quickly established a brutal occupation, exploiting the country's resources and treating the Filipino population harshly. They fortified key positions and established strong defensive lines throughout the islands. After the Battle of Midway in 1942 and subsequent victories in the Pacific, the Allied forces began to push back against Japanese expansion. The Philippines remained a crucial strategic objective, both for its location and its resources, particularly oil and agricultural products, which were critical to the Japanese war effort. The planning of the return. In 1944, following the successful campaigns in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea and the Marianas, the Allies turned their attention to the Philippines. The Philippine Sea Battle in June 1944 and the capture of Saipan the following month had eliminated Japanese air and naval threats in the region, paving the way for the invasion of the Philippines. General MacArthur, having been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, led the charge for the Philippines' liberation. MacArthur's leadership was seen as both a strategic necessity and a symbolic gesture. In 1944, Allied planners recognized the need to retake the Philippines to sever Japanese lines of communication and supply and to provide air bases for the subsequent assault on the Japanese homeland. The invasion, Leyte landings. The Leyte landings on October 20, 1944, were the first step in the liberation of the Philippines. MacArthur's Sixth Army, supported by naval forces under Admiral William Halsey, launched a massive amphibious assault on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. This marked the beginning of a series of landings on various Philippine islands, starting with Leyte, followed by the battles of Mindoro, Luzon, and Iwo Jima. The invasion of Leyte was one of the largest amphibious assaults of the Pacific War, involving over 700 ships, 100,000 troops and massive air support. The Japanese, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, mounted a determined defense, but they were severely outnumbered and outgunned. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which took place shortly after the landings, was a catastrophic defeat for the Japanese Imperial Navy, effectively eliminating their ability to contest the invasion from the sea. The battle was the largest naval engagement of World War II, involving nearly 300 warships, and it resulted in the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers, including the Zuikaku and Shokaku, which had been part of the fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. The defeat left the Japanese Navy unable to provide substantial support for their forces on the islands, making it easier for the Allies to secure Leyte. The liberation of the Philippines, battles on land and sea. The fighting on Leyte continued for several months as Japanese forces mounted increasingly desperate resistance. Despite the overwhelming strength of the Allied forces, the Japanese military, adhering to their doctrine of no surrender, put up fierce resistance. The Japanese launched numerous counterattacks and suicide missions, including kamikaze attacks, in an attempt to drive the invaders back. As U.S. forces captured Leyte, they pushed northward to Luzon, the largest and most populous island in the Philippines. The battle for Manila in 1945 would be one of the most brutal and destructive of the war, with heavy fighting in urban areas and widespread destruction of the city. Japanese forces, though outmatched, continued to fight tenaciously. In addition to the intense ground combat, the Japanese also sought to defend their supply routes and communication lines. The campaign saw a return of deadly aerial combat, including kamikaze attacks by Japanese pilots, who flew suicide missions to try and inflict damage on American ships and ground forces. Despite these challenges, the U.S. was able to achieve a series of successes, culminating in the liberation of Manila in February 1945. The aftermath, Japanese defeat and the Philippines' role in the Pacific War. The liberation of the Philippines proved to be a turning point in the Pacific War. By the end of 1944, the Japanese had suffered heavy losses, with their navy decimated, and their air force significantly weakened. The recapture of the Philippines deprived Japan of vital resources and cut off many of their forces in Southeast Asia from resupply. The American victory in the Philippines also set the stage for the invasion of Okinawa, and further weakened Japan's defensive capabilities ahead of the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. In addition to its military impact, the return to the Philippines had profound political and symbolic significance. For the Filipino people, the American-led liberation was a momentous event. The brutal Japanese occupation, during which thousands of civilians were killed or mistreated, had left deep scars. The return of General MacArthur, who had famously vowed to return after being forced to evacuate in 1942, was seen as a powerful moment of hope and renewal for the Filipino population. MacArthur's leadership and the successful invasion provided a sense of fulfillment for both the U.S. military and the Filipino people, who had long suffered under Japanese oppression. Conclusion: the Philippines and the end of the Pacific War. The return to the Philippines was one of the largest and most complex operations in the Pacific War, and its success was crucial in the eventual defeat of Japan. The campaign not only liberated the Philippines but also crippled Japan's ability to continue the war. With key islands like Leyte, Luzon, and Mindoro secured, the U.S. was able to establish airfields and naval bases that would be critical for future operations. The battle for the Philippines also marked the beginning of the end for Japan's empire. The Allied forces' strategic use of the islands, including the subsequent attacks on Okinawa and the eventual atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ensured Japan's surrender in 1945. The return to the Philippines, in its military, political, and symbolic significance, remains one of the defining moments of the Pacific War.